Today we're going to be talking about acoustic panels. Now there are a ton of YouTube videos out there discussing do-it-yourself acoustic panels, and many of those use the same material that I chose to use for my panels. However, very few, if any, use a particular dimension of this very popular acoustic material for their panels. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so these are my panels and this is my setup. It's pretty obvious. You can see I've got two panels up here on the ceiling. Then I've got two panels on the sides, which are acting as my bass straps. And then I'm going to spin around here, hopefully not too fast to make you sick. And in the back of the room, I've got one over here on this side and one on this side. So let me turn back around and we'll talk a little bit more about what they're made out of and why they're there. So my room is actually close to the golden ratio. It's about 12.8 feet long, about 10.3 feet wide, and I have 9-foot ceilings. And if you don't know what the golden ratio is, it's more or less an ideal setting for acoustics in a room. So I'll go ahead and tell you what I used for the acoustic material. It is Owens Corning 703. It's pretty popular, and I'll go into a little bit more of its characteristics later on in the video. And I know this is probably overkill for this room, and the dimensions that I used for the Owens Corning 703 is 4 inches thick. So most of the time you'll see this in 2 inches, and that's fine. I mean, you can stack them together to make 4 inches, and I suppose you have more options that way. But long story short, I didn't even actually want this for my room. It kind of happened by accident. My church was ordering some for one of their rooms, and I got in on the order thinking it would accomplish something else for my room. But in the end, I just was kind of stuck with them, and so I decided to make some panels and make the best out of it. So don't judge me on my placement. I did the best I could. I don't really use this room for any kind of heavy mixing or anything. I just kind of do YouTube videos and maybe some demos. And so I'm not looking to get an ideal mixing room. I was just trying to help the acoustics out a little bit and cut down on the reverb. Yeah, so for whatever reason, there's not a lot of videos on YouTube about how to frame 4-inch thick Owens Corning 703. And so that's why I wanted to make this video and hopefully give you some ideas about how to do it. And by the way, the reverb that you're probably hearing right now is due to the fact that I'm standing in a hallway outside of the room. One other thing I'll mention that I'm aware of is that normally you would have some panels at early reflection points for your monitors. In other words, you would sit in your chair where you're gonna mix, and you would have a friend take a mirror on either side of your speakers on the walls. And when you see the speaker in the mirror, you tell your friend and they put a mark there, and you can put a panel over there. So I didn't do that, obviously. One reason is this is the only blank wall I have in this room, and I wanted to reserve that to make YouTube videos and have a blank background if need be. And then the other reason is that I have a window over here, and obviously I didn't want to cover up the window. So again, I'm not trying to create a perfect studio environment. I'm simply trying to make the acoustics of this room sound a little bit better. And of course, everyone's room and everyone's situation is different. I just want to give you some ideas and to show you my room as an example. Okay, let's move on to the rest of the video where I go into more detail about how I made the panels. So as I said before, this is the material that I chose to use. It is Owens Corning 703, and again, it is 2 feet wide by 4 feet long and 4 inches thick. Now you can go online to a number of different websites and look up the acoustic properties of this material. They have things like the noise reduction coefficient values at various frequencies, but suffice it to say that being 4 inches thick, there's enough material there where it makes a pretty good bass trap. But most of the information I've come across says it's also excellent at high and mid frequency absorption as well. So it's just a good overall material for an acoustic panel. Now I also came across some material that said this could be easily wrapped without needing a frame, but in my mind, if you're going to wrap some fabric around this acoustic material, you're more or less going to have to glue it together because it's not going to hold staples. And you do want to wrap it in something, otherwise the fiberglass material could become loose and get airborne and you could inhale it in your lungs, and that of course would be a bad situation. So back to wrapping the panel without a frame, you could do that, and that might come in handy for a bass or corner trap where you want to put the panel on the floor. But if you want to hang the panel on a wall or a ceiling, there's really not any material there to attach the hardware to. So in most applications, you're gonna need a frame, and that's what I'm gonna show you next, is how I built a frame for this Owens Corning 703 material. So this is the frame that I use for the panels, and in essence it's pretty simple, but I will go over a few details that I had to think about when putting it together. So the wood that I chose to use was 1x4, and now if you know anything about lumber dimensions, you know that that's a nominal measurement, and in here in America we're talking about inches. So actually that comes out to be 3/4 of an inch by 3.5 inches wide. So that's 3/4 of an inch thick by 3.5 inches wide. And so the inner dimensions of the frame match the dimensions of the acoustic material, which is of course 2 feet by 4 feet. Now on the long side of the frame, I chose a length of 4 feet or 48 inches. However, on the shorter side, I had to make that 25.5 inches in order to actually frame the material inside. So the actual overall outside dimensions of the frame are 49.5 inches by 25.5 inches. However, like I said, the long pieces are 48 inches and the short pieces are 25.5 inches. Now, of course, you could do this a number of different ways. I chose to do it the way I did because I bought the lumber in 8-foot lengths, and the math just worked out better for me to cut those boards in half at 4 feet, give or take about a 1/16 of an inch for the saw blade. Another feature of the frame that I want to point out is how I actually attach the pieces together. So you could put screws right into the ends of the pieces of wood, but that doesn't provide a lot of strength. I've also seen people use corner braces or other types of braces on the back of their frames. I didn't have that luxury because of the dimensions I was using, but I'll go into that a little bit later in the video. So bottom line, I wanted to use something with a decent amount of strength, but something that wasn't overkill. So if you look in the lower right hand part of the screen, you'll see these odd looking holes, and those are actually called pocket holes, and that's what I'm going to show you next. So what you're looking at here is called a Craig Jig R3, I believe. It's from the manufacturer Craig, and it simply makes pocket holes. This is one of their cheaper jigs, or basically it's just a kit. It only costs maybe $30 to $40, so if you already own a drill and you're looking to make some joints that are stronger than a typical joint, it's really a worthwhile investment, and it's really easy to do. The only downside or thing I don't like about this particular jig is I don't feel the holes are spaced wide enough. So typically I'll drill one hole, unclamp it, clamp it again, and then drill another hole. So it takes a little bit more time, but if you're okay with the spacing of the holes as is, of course that's a faster way to do it. One other quick thing I forgot to mention about the wood, you can really use whatever you want, but I chose to use rough cut or re-sawn wood, which has one side that's kind of rough and one side that's kind of smooth. Now I put the rougher side against the acoustic material, and so that the smooth side will be on the outside that was in contact with the fabric that I used. So it saved me quite a bit of money using this type of wood, but it's just as strong and just as durable and works just as well. So as for actually attaching the pieces together, I started to use a corner clamp that I have from Harbor Freight just to make the frame fit together square, but actually was just more cumbersome and inhibited my ability to do it quickly. And so I actually ended up just putting the two pieces of wood together and drilling the screws in as was, and it didn't make that much of a difference. They weren't off square that much, and so I found that way to be a quicker and more efficient way to do it. So once the frame was done, there's really not much to explain here. I grabbed some of the Owens Corning 703 material and placed it into the frame. It was a pretty tight fit. You may choose to use gloves to handle the material. I started doing it, but I ended up just using my bare hands. I didn't notice any kind of irritation or fiberglass material in my hands, but of course I did use caution and handle the material with care. So one of the things that baffled me for a while when thinking about how to put these panels together was how I was going to frame this 4-inch thick material. Being that it was 4 inches thick, they don't really make a lot of timber that's easily available that's 4 inches wide. Like I said before, there's nominal sizes that's 4 inches, like a 1x4, but that's actually 3.5 inches wide. They do make or there is a nominal size of like a 1x5, which is 4.5 inches wide, but those are hard to find, and it just becomes expensive when you try to get the material needed to make all the frames if you're doing, more than one at a time. So I had this sort of eureka moment when I realized that the acoustic material is only going to stick out of the frame a 1/2 inch, and of course the material is compressible. Now you don't want to compress it a lot, of course, because it may affect the acoustic properties. But I came to realize that the material that I was going to cover the back of the frame with, which is actually simple landscaping fabric, would easily cover the 1/2 inch difference, and it would almost be as if it wasn't even there. So like I said, the material on the back was just simple landscaping fabric, and you do want to have something on the back of your panel because this stuff is made out of fiberglass, and you don't want that fiberglass material to become loose because it could get into the air, and as I alluded to earlier, you don't want to be breathing that stuff in. So the key here is to get a material that you can actually see through or maybe even breathe through. You don't have to get landscaping fabric or a weed barrier, which is what this stuff is, but it needs to be something, like I said, that you can kind of see through and that air can pass through. The first stuff I got was a weed barrier, but it was made more of like a plastic material, and I didn't know if it was going to be reflective of sound, so I went back and I got something that was more like fabric material or something that felt more like cotton, and that was what this stuff was, and it seemed to work really well. Of course, if you're building a panel of this dimension, you want to get something that's at least 2 feet wide. I believe what I got was about 2.5 feet wide, so in the end I had to cut off some excess material, but the stuff's pretty cheap and it wasn't that big of a deal. Other than that, I just went around with a staple gun and put a staple in every couple of inches. Now my staple gun was a handheld one, which means that oftentimes the staples didn't go into the wood as well as I would hope, and so I had to go back with a hammer and make sure that the staples went all the way into the wood. Additionally, of course, it takes more physical effort to use one of these guns. Your hand can easily get fatigued from doing this over and over again, so if you have an electric or a pneumatic staple gun, it's obviously the best way to go. I just happen to have one of these laying around the house already, so it made more sense for me to go ahead and use it. Keep in mind that if you're doing this, you don't have to have the edges of the fabric on the back of the panel perfect, because it will be covered up by the fabric that covers the remainder of the panel, which is what we're going to talk about next. So I knew pretty early on that burlap was going to be the best choice of fabric for me personally for this project. It's inexpensive, it's breathable. In other words, you can kind of see through it, air can easily pass through it, and that means that sound waves are not going to bounce off of it, and it's not going to interfere with the acoustic material behind it. And on top of that, it comes in a variety of neutral colors that will fit in almost any room. As a matter of fact, I was surprised when I started looking into it how many color options there are for burlap. So there were 2 stores that I visited in search of burlap. Because I didn't want to buy it online, I wanted to see it in person. One was Walmart and the other was Jo-Ann Fabric, which is essentially an arts and crafts store here in the United States. There are essentially 4 main colors, one being I would call a tan or brown, typical color that you think of when you think of burlap. The other one is like a sand color. It's more or less an off-white. The third one is a sage color, which I thought when I looked at pictures online it would be kind of like a cool gray color, but it turns out it's more of like a pale green. And then the 4th color is black. Now, as you can see from some of these reference photos that I took for myself at Walmart, I actually found a sponge which was supposed to be indicative of the color of the Owens Corning 703 material. I just wanted to get an idea of what something kind of yellow would look like behind each color of burlap. I found that most of the colors hid the yellow sponge pretty well, but there's one color in particular of burlap that you probably want to stay away from, and I'm going to get to that in a second. So what happened in my situation is after some debating, I went with the typical color of burlap, which again is sort of a tan color. I purchased some of it and I even finished one entire panel in the fabric. However, when I put it up in the room, which happened to be at night for whatever reason, it looked to me like the color of the burlap really clashed with the color of my carpet. Now let me just say that I realize that the preferred flooring for most studios is not carpet. However, this is my house. This is the room that I'm working with. I don't really do any heavy mixing, so it is what it is. So anyway, the next day when it was actually daylight, the burlap almost had an entirely different color to it, and it looked like it matched my carpet much better. However, I was still on the fence, and so I thought, well, maybe I should try black. Big mistake. I actually bought some of this black burlap, finished an entire panel in it, turned it over, stepped back and looked at it and thought, wow, this is horrible. It looked like Batman's bedsheets or something. You could totally see the bright yellow Owens Corning material coming through the black, and I instantly recognized that this was not going to work. So this is my warning to you, don't try to use black burlap for this type of acoustic material. The only way you could possibly use it in my mind, unless for some reason you like the color, is to double up on the fabric, and that just defeats the purpose of having the material be breathable. So needless to say, I scrapped the black burlap material and went with a typical run-of-the-mill tan burlap color. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind as far as actually applying the fabric to the acoustic panels is that burlap, if you so choose to use it, is probably going to have some wrinkles in it just due to the fact that it's been rolled up for storage or shipping. One easy way to get rid of most of the wrinkles, as you can see here, and please forgive my black socks with shorts. I know that's probably not the most pleasant thing to be looking at, but on to the point. Instead of trying to sort of iron out the burlap, you can just put some water in a spray bottle, lightly spray the wrinkles, and then sort of stretch out the burlap. And then as the fabric dries, the wrinkles sort of just disappear. Another thing to keep in mind when cutting the fabric for each panel is ensuring that you have enough material to cover the sides and back of the frame. This is also something to consider, of course, when you're purchasing your fabric. You want to ensure that you're not just going off the 2x4 foot dimensions of the acoustic material, but that you're also considering the frame. I'd say you want to have at least about 5 additional inches of fabric on the outside dimension of the frame to ensure you have enough material to work with. I made the mistake of not having enough fabric on one of my first panels, as you can see here, but fortunately it was on the top of one of the ones that was going in the upper corner of my room, which no one was going to see. So I have to preface this next part. When I film this, I have my camera on a tripod, and so whenever I would staple or go back and hammer a stubborn staple, the impact would cause the camera to shake. So unfortunately, you're going to be seeing a lot of that, and I apologize in advance. But as far as applying the fabric, there's really not an exact science to it. You just want to make sure that once you do a side or an end, that you pull the material tight on the opposite end so that you don't have any wrinkles or sags on the front of the panel. But fortunately, this is a forgiving process. I would just recommend paying attention as you go, and if you start to get off or things start to go wrong, just pull out the staples you put in and try again. Now maybe the one tricky part about this, and something that everyone seems to do differently, is the corners. There's really no wrong or right way to do this as well. I'm showing you my method here. I can't really even describe what I'm doing. It's sort of just like wrapping a present, and the more you do it, the more you get the hang of it. But like I said, it's something where if you mess up, you just pull the staples out and try again. Other than that, you just need to cut off the excess fabric. Now if you're using burlap, you will have some frayed ends, but depending on where you're actually going to mount the panel, it may not matter. However, I did come up with a pretty good way to hide the frayed edges, which I'll show you later on. One thing I didn't think about at the time, but is possibly an option, is to apply the backing material after you apply the burlap. So in other words, the backing material, in this case weed barrier or landscaping fabric, would sit on top of the burlap, and thus theoretically would hide the frayed edges. I mentioned earlier that you could lightly spray the burlap to get rid of some of the wrinkles. One of the cool things is that you can actually do this when the panels are finished to get rid of some of the remaining wrinkles. Just keep in mind that you don't want to go overboard with the water and keep it to a light mist. Okay, so now we're going to move on to putting the finishing touches on the panels and actually hanging them up. One thing I touched on earlier, if you remember, is that with the burlap, you can end up with some frayed edges on the back of the panels. And again, this may or may not be an issue depending on where you're going to hang the panels. I wasn't sure if this was going to be an issue for me or not, but because of the way I hung the panels off the wall, for some of those in a more prominent location by the door that I walked in and out of, I wanted to hide a little bit better. So the method that I came up with, as you can see here, is to apply some black tape to the edge of the burlap. Now I thought about using gaffer's tape, which they use on a lot of stages, but come to find out that stuff's pretty expensive. And so instead I found some black duct tape, which is relatively inexpensive. So as for the look, the black duct tape did exactly what I wanted it to do, and it hid the frayed edges really well. However, what I found out is that the duct tape did not stick to the burlap very well at all. So what I ended up doing is applying some general purpose spray adhesive between the duct tape and the burlap, which trying to spray the adhesive in such a tight spot wasn't the easiest thing to do, and it can get pretty messy if you're not careful. So I'd imagine there might be a better way to do this, so if you have any ideas, feel free to comment below. But I will say that in the end I was satisfied with the results. Okay, moving on to mounting the panels. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing this is to have an idea of how much each panel weighs. I weighed mine and they came in at about 15 pounds, but I think it has a lot to do with the lumber that you're using. The Re-sawn wood that I got was very light and that came in handy. But your mileage could vary depending on the wood that you use. So for the panels that I mounted on a single wall, I used only one hanger, and that was a 50-pound rated oak hook. Now keep in mind that the panels only weigh about 15 pounds, so it was probably overkill, but I had full assurance that the panels weren't going to fall off the wall. As far as the hardware actually attached to the panel, I used a combination of something called screw eyes and picture wire. And screw eyes aren't really anything unique, that's just the official name of them, but they're essentially just a screw with the loop on the end. I ended up using two different types. I used both a number 210 and a number 212 screw eye. the 210 being the more robust of the two. And although I don't think there's anything wrong with using the 212, they just looked a little suspect when holding up something so large compared to their size. Regarding the picture wire, I ended up with two types of those as well. One was a 10 pound and one was a 30 pound. The 10 pound was very pliable and fragile. It was almost like solder wire if you've ever done any soldering. So to compensate for that, I doubled up on the wire, but it still looked a little questionable. The 30 pound wire looked much more sturdy and durable. It all depends on what's available to you, but I would definitely recommend something in the 20 to 30 pound range. So for hanging one panel on a single hook, the only thing really left to do is to make sure you measure properly. And that's something that I really can't specify because your situation will be unique to your environment. So for the panels that I hung in the corners of the room, I used 2 oak hooks instead of 1. Ideally, you would want to space the hooks equally from the corner of the wall, but in my case, I had a window in the way, and so I had to space the hooks differently and hang the panel at a slightly off-centered angle. For the back of these panels, I used the same type of hardware, but in this case, I made a loop with the picture wire at each screw eye. And again, I would recommend measuring properly and taking the time to consider where you want everything to line up. Now, I can't take credit for coming up with this method for hanging the panels in the corner. I got the idea from GIK Acoustics, so I want to make sure I recognize them. Go check out their YouTube channel if you have a chance. So finally, that leaves us with the panels that I hung from the ceiling. I will say up front that these are probably the most challenging to hang. In my case, the ceiling joists ran lengthwise with the direction that I wanted to hang the panels. So I essentially chose the 2 joists closest to the area I wanted to hang the panels and screwed hooks directly into those joists. Now I did this all by myself without any kind of laser equipment. I used a combination of tape measures and some levels and pencil marks. It turned out pretty well, but I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall watching myself try to do this. And I'll say again, measuring is probably the most difficult part of all this, but it's important that you get it right. So for the hardware on the back of these panels, I again used screw eyes. However, instead of trying to directly attach the screw eyes to the screw hooks, I used S-hooks. At first I didn't think I would need these and I thought they would make the panels hang too low, but they turned out to be really useful. Instead of having to line the hooks up perfectly, the S-hooks provide some forgiveness and allow you a little bit of wiggle room. The only thing I forgot to mention is how I spaced some of the panels off of the wall. I simply used some corks or bottle stoppers. The ones that I got came from Amazon and they're classified as a number 9 tapered cork. The important dimension here is the height or the length of the cork, and these measure just over an inch, maybe an inch and an eighth. The way I installed these wasn't complicated at all. I simply pulled the panel off the wall a little bit and put the cork behind it. I considered attaching the corks to the panels themselves, but the weight of the panels pushing against the wall hold the corks in place just fine. Okay, so that about does it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and we'll see you in the next one.